I wanted to make a video to help you troubleshoot why you're not able to sharpen your knives correctly, or maybe why you're not getting the edges that you want. Maybe you're getting your knives somewhat sharp, but they're not really cutting how you want them to. In this video, I'm going to tell you about 3 of the most common issues I see with most beginner sharpeners, so let's get rolling. So first off, and what I think is most important, is you're not sharpening the right knives. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is the knives are either super low quality or they're extremely dull. For example, a low quality knife could be a knife steel where the composition is just kind of weird, the heat treat wasn't good, it just wasn't made well. Another example could be that the factory edge, the first edge that they ground on the edge of the knife, your secondary bevel or your cutting edge, just wasn't ground that well. So for a beginner sharpener, it's going to be really hard to improve that factory edge because you don't have the level of experience it would take to regrind that. An example of the dull knives could be maybe you're trying to sharpen a friend's or a family member's kitchen knife that they've used for 5 years. It never had a great edge to start. They've literally used it for years and have never sharpened it. For one, like I had said previously, they may not even be great quality knives to start with. But number 2, if they're super dull and they're bad quality knives, you are going to be in for a nightmare if you're starting to try and sharpen knives. I would steer you far away from super dull knives or knives that just haven't been maintained or knives that haven't been made well. If you want to begin sharpening, what I would recommend is getting some decent knives. And how are you going to know if it's a decent knife? Well, one of the best ways you can test a knife to see if it's actually good is see how it cuts things. And I'll show you a test that anyone can do, even if you don't have vegetables or fruit or anything to cut. But you can just take a paper towel or some toilet paper, and what you're going to do is roll it up and see how the knife cuts through it. So I'm going to show you an example of 2 different knives, one that has a good edge and one that doesn't. Like I said, get some toilet paper or paper towel and just roll it up pretty tight. All right, let's try and cut with this teal handled knife first and see how it cuts. Okay. So I think I barely pierced through the layers there. Now let's see what this knife does. Okay, so basically cut through the whole thing, no problem. A decent knife will cut through this with no problem. It'll just do it. And a dull knife is just not going to be able to penetrate that paper that well. Even with a lot of pressure, I mean, I have to push super hard on that. And really, it's getting through it a little bit. It's really just pushing on the paper rather than cutting it. So I would recommend finding something that has a decent edge on it. It doesn't have to be this sharp. I just sharpened this recently. But find something that isn't this dull to try and sharpen. Find something a little bit less sharp than this, where maybe when you're trying to cut through this, it takes you a few times, but it gets through it. Reason number 2. All right, so what do I mean you're not using the right abrasive? Well, there are different grit levels for sharpening, and each grit level has a certain purpose. So if you understand the different grit levels and what they do for your knife, then you can really figure out which one to use depending on what condition your knife edge is in. What grit level would I recommend to a beginner sharpener? It really depends on what knife you're sharpening and what condition the edge is in, but I think a safe bet would be anywhere around the 1000 grit range. Now you could go a little bit more or a little bit less than that, maybe more like 800, maybe down to 600, or you could go to like a 1500 or a 2000 grit. The one thing to keep in mind is the lower you go on the grit level, the more metal it's going to remove. So if you went on more of like a 600 grit, you're going to remove quite a bit of metal, and if you're not able to hold the right angle, it's going to be a lot easier to mess up your knife. Now if you stick around the 1500 or you go to the 2000 range, you're going to remove a lot less metal, which might take you a little bit longer to form a burr. But the advantage is, if you're not able to maintain that angle, you're not going to mess up the knife as quick. So those are some things to consider when thinking about grit level. Here is reason number 3. Not the right angle. This can be one of the hardest things to tackle when knife sharpening. What angle do I sharpen this knife? And oftentimes, the biggest mistake a beginner sharpener makes is they don't have high enough of an angle. They barely lift up the knife edge and try and sharpen it. And what's going to happen when you do that is you're not going to be actually hitting the apex or the absolute point of the knife. So you're really going to be grinding lower than that, and you're never going to be able to form a burr, and you're really going to mess up your knife. If you want to learn some tricks on how to find the angle to sharpen your knife, I've made a lot of videos on this. What I'll do is put my most popular one in the description of this video so you can check that out. Let me show you really quickly on a stone what it looks like to have just too low of an angle. Alright, so what a lot of beginner sharpeners are going to do is they're going to put their knife flat on the stone and they're just going to raise it up like just that tiny bit. And what that's going to do is actually not grind into the cutting edge of the knife, but something called the shoulder, which is just above the cutting edge. And that is not what you want to do. For this knife, this was the angle it was ground at. So look at that compared to what a lot of people do is just this, or maybe a little bit higher. If you can find the angle the knife was actually ground at, you are going to save yourself a ton of time and your knives are going to get really sharp really fast. I really believe if you find a decent knife, you have the right abrasive, and you know how to find the angle, you're going to have a lot easier time sharpening your knife. And thank you so much for joining me today. We'll see you in the next video.